This is where the concept of scheduled access comes into play. Let's assume we start with an initial condition that the AP knows that Station 1 and Station 2 have a large amount of data to transmit. Like we said earlier, if you have a large package to transport, you'll get the entire 18-wheeler. From past transmissions, the AP knows that Station 1 and Station 2 have a large amount of data to transfer. The first trigger frame goes out knowing that Station 1 has a lot of data to transmit, so it tells Station 1, you have a lot of data, transmit it to me, so it gives it a large resource unit. Station 1 transmits the data, and at the end of this transmission, let's say Station 1 says that it has a little more data to transmit. The AP will acknowledge the data and then send the next trigger, frame 2, to Station 2 because it knows this device also has lots of data to transmit, so it gives Station 2 the entire 80 MHz channel. Station 2 transmits its data, and at the end of the transmission, it says, I have a little more data to transmit. Now the AP knows two clients are waiting with a little more data, so it sends the third trigger frame, knowing that Station 1 and 2 have a little more data to transmit, so it gives 1/4 of the 80 MHz spectrum to Station 1 and 1/4 to Station 2. There is still 50% of 80 MHz spectrum left, so I'll break that into two chunks as well. For Station 3 and 4, it's a free-for-all. If they want to transmit to the AP, they'll do a random backoff, listen to see if the air is free, and try to transmit. So with trigger frame 3, two clients get dedicated spectrum, 1 and 2. The third and fourth client contend for access. If 3 and 4 collide, they back off and then either picks the third chunk on the spectrum or the fourth chunk on the spectrum to transmit. As a result, you can see that the collision priority has been reduced overall because one client might choose the third chunk of spectrum and the other might choose the fourth chunk. I'll show an example a little later of that situation. In this case, Station 4 has some amount of data by the time it says, I'm going to grab the third chunk of spectrum and transmit on it. So what happened in this time period is Station 1 and Station 2 were truly scheduled. They got the spectrum. Station 4 did a random access and got access to the third chunk of the spectrum, and it transmitted some data. And at the end of this transmission, Station 1 says, I have some more data to transmit. Station 2 says, I don't have any more data to transmit. Station 4 got the medium through random access, and he says, I have a medium amount of data to transmit. On the fourth trigger frame, it says Station 1 already told me it has some more data to transmit, so it gets one chunk of the spectrum. Station 2 says I don't need any data, so the AP won't allocate anything to him. Station 4 said I have a medium amount of data, so the AP gives him a little bit more spectrum. So in this example, I give him 2 RUs to transmit, and that's what we're showing here. Then there's still this fourth chunk of spectrum that's left, and I say that anybody that has data, they can tell me, and they can use this fourth chunk of spectrum. So at this point, Station 1 uses one chunk, Station 4 uses 2 chunks, and Station 3 uses that free chunk to tell me something, and then this process continues. In this fifth and last trigger frame, I allocate to Station 3 and Station 4 25% of the channel frequency each, so let's say they get 20 megahertz each. The third one a fourth, and the final 1/4 is free, and anybody can random access these. What we're depicting here is that both Station 2 and Station 5 pick the same 1/4 of the free spectrum. So here we're showing them in the same color, meaning that both are colliding. What really happened at this time is that Station 3 and 4 got their data through, and Stations 2 and 5, they flipped the coin and both ended up heads and used the same portion of the spectrum and collided. So that information got lost. The thing I'm pointing out here with this slide is that with OFDM, the entire 80 megahertz spectrum got lost when collisions occur. Now, with OFDMA, only a small portion gets lost. And I'm also pointing out that there's more dimensions than just the time dimension. There can be multiple chunks that get elected for random access. So in this last scenario, there were 2 chunks that were available for random access. I don't lose the entire spectrum. Things become much cleaner with OFDMA. The trigger frame is the key. So to summarize what we've described in the past several slides, I mentioned earlier that the world is going to look different with 11AX, primarily because of OFDMA. This is a figurative way of looking at it. Today's world is represented by the picture on the left. There is a multi-lane highway with everyone trying to grab their space, and it's not the most efficient way. With OFDMA and the scheduled access, things will look a lot like the right-hand side. It's all controlled. The AP decides who's next. Things look a lot cleaner. That's what's happening in cellular networks today. OFDMA is very widely used today. We live in this world where we easily use 80 or 160 megahertz spectrum in the cellular world that never gets allocated to the same device. They only get little chunks of the spectrum. With OFDMA, because of scheduled access, things like QoS and other things are moved under the AP's control. It's not like a free-for-all. The AP will say which client gets more spectrum. The AP becomes the master and becomes more and more complex, and this is the world we're headed to with more complexity with 11AX. How does OFDMA increase range? A cellular base station covers a much larger area than an AP, yet a cell phone with Wi-Fi has trouble talking with an AP that might be 100 plus meters away, but it doesn't have a problem talking to an LTE base station that's a half-mile away. How does this work when it's the same battery, hardware, and wireless antenna? This slide helps to answer that question. Frequently, every problem that is attributed to Wi-Fi is blamed on the access point and not on the client. We often run into situations where I'm in one corner of my house that is far from an AP, yet my phone picks up the beacon from the AP and displays the SSID. However, when I try to connect to the AP, it's not successful because it's too far away from the phone. Although an AP will broadcast a higher dBm, say 30 to 36 dBm, or whatever the FCC or local government agency allows, the phone is only transmitting between 15 to 20 dBm. There is typically a 10 dBm gap between the uplink and downlink. The AP can talk to the phone, but the phone won't talk to the AP. It will hear, but it cancels its probe because its lower dBm level is not reaching the AP. People blame it on the AP, but the problem is that the phone can't shout as loud as the AP. Let's look at an example. Let's say that I have a power amplifier with a certain amount of power that's available to me. If I'm using an 80 megahertz band, that power is spread out over 80 megahertz. Using an analogy, let's say I have a stick of butter and two slices of bread, one very large and one very small. If I take the stick of butter and spread it over the big slice of bread, the thickness of the butter will be very small. But if I spread the stick of butter over a small piece of bread, the thickness will be much larger. In Wi-Fi, we call this power spectrum density. You take a given amount of power and spread it over 80 megahertz, which is what 11AC allows me to do. This is represented by the diagram on the left. However, notice there is a gap of noise because my client is far away from the AP. By the time it reaches the AP, it's below the noise level. Now I change the scenario, like spreading a stick of butter over a small piece of bread. With OFDMA, I can give you a 2 MHz channel versus an 80 MHz channel, so it puts the same power in a much smaller spectrum. This is what we're showing on the right side of the slide. The green rectangle is my power, and the power is spread over a much narrower band. Now the signal looks very thick and tall. It's going to be much stronger than the noise when the signal reaches the AP. This is how LTE does it today. The same phone can talk to a faraway base station because it's using a much narrower spectrum to talk to the base station. Another question that is asked is, since resource units are getting split for clients in 11AX, how is this different from multi-user MIMO? We'll discuss that in the next section.